Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK 2013 public lecture series. This is our fourth lecture of the series, and I will be chairing it. My name is Mansoor Ali, and I'm a lecturer here at the University in Islamic Studies. The topic today on the challenges of mental illness in British Muslim communities is a very pertinent one, because people still in the Muslim community do not talk about mental illness, and they still believe that there is stigma attached to mental illness and it's a taboo. But before we proceed, I just want to go through some housekeeping rules. Can I just get people, first of all, just to move, because we get people coming in later in and people start loitering, so if you don't mind, just move across. We are not expecting any fire drills today, so if there is a fire alarm, then the exits are here and there. It's a real fire alarm. The lecture will last for 40 to 45 minutes with 15 to 20 minutes question and answers. And can everybody please put their phones on silent? Dr. Asim Yusuf is a young scholar who straddles between the world of the mind and the heart. By profession, he is a consultant psychiatrist with a particular interest in mental health and spirituality. His religious calling led him to drink from the wisdom of the sages of the Islamic sacred tradition. His studies in traditional Islamic sciences varied from law to spirituality and what lies in between. The ijaza or licence was conferred upon him, which now gave him the authority to pass on this wisdom to posterity. He holds advisory responsibilities in a number of Islamic projects and institutions, and is a director of the Path to Salvation Diploma in Islamic Studies. He also sits on the advisory board for the Islamic Medical Ethics Council alongside high-caliber scholars such as Professor Tariq Ramadan, Mufti Muhammad ibn Adam al-Kawthari, and Imam Yunus Dudwala. Not only is he a scholar, a teacher, a writer and an orator, but he's also blessed with a sweet, melodious voice, which is a result of his having been a part of the Manchester Boys Choir, where he spent the formative years of his life. He began composing spiritual poetry and songs at the age of 16 and has continued to do so ever since. In early 2004, he was encouraged to compile a collection of English language spiritual songs, which has culminated in Songs of Innocence, an intensely personal journey into the experiential dimension of Islam. He sings using the pen name Talib al-Habib, which means seeker of the beloved. And without further ado, I will call him onto the stage to enlighten us with his speech. Dr. Asim.
والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah to all of you here. And thank you very much for attending. I'm not sure what to say about that introduction. I'm sure it's not what I emailed to you. And I'm hoping that, I'm very pleased that there's such a good turnout and a lot of interest in this. I'm sure that the interest is because of the pressing needs of the Muslim community when it comes to mental health, as opposed to you wanting to hear me sing. And I hope that I will be able to do justice to the introduction, and also to the topic, which of course is a very, very important topic. The topic, as you are aware, is the Muslim experience of mental illness and mental health in the United Kingdom. And this is actually sort of based on a talk I prepared for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I've amended it in order, I think, rather than to give a more theoretical approach to Islamic psychotherapy or Islamic psychology, to look more at the actual experience of Muslims with mental illnesses in this country. And I'm hoping that it will provide an overview. And I'm actually warning you as well, that all it's going to be is an overview. The more topics you try to cover, I think, the less depth you can cover them in. There is a lot of depth we can go into with any one of the particular topics. I was last week, I bumped into a psychologist colleague of mine in the corridor. We had just seen a patient together. And we spoke in the corridor for half an hour about one comment that I had made to the patient, which was about the effect of the belief in destiny on the depressive experience that they had. And I made the point that you can't take for granted that the effect will be beneficial. Not necessarily. So we spoke for half an hour just about that. Poor lady in the corridor, she had to go home, but I trapped her, I think. So if I do go on, I'm sure the chairman will stop me. I think there's about 30 slides. I have no idea how I'm going to get through them in 40 minutes. But I'm happy to take questions, obviously, at the end. So if we can just hurry things along. Right, so firstly, the layout of the presentation. We're going to begin at the beginning and look at important definitions. That's the first thing, I think. Then we're going to move on to a Muslim perspective on Muslim mental, or rather a medical perspective on Muslim mental health. Then an Islamic perspective on Muslim mental health, and then hopefully at a way, looking at ways forward from there. So this is some advice from the King of Hearts, not the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, not Imam Ghazali, not Rumi, but the actual King of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland, which is begin at the beginning, go forward until you reach the end, and then stop. That's what I'm going to endeavour to do. Alice in Wonderland's great. If you read it, it's great. It's full of wisdom, and this is one of them. Because the first question you have to ask yourself whenever you deal with a topic like this is, well, what is the beginning? Where do you begin? And a good place always to start is to look at the title of the talk and deconstruct it, and that's, I think, what I'm going to be doing, really. It's really important to define things clearly. A lot of problems can be avoided if you define things clearly. What I'm going to try to do right at the beginning is just to clarify some of the terms that we're going to use here, because they're very easy to misunderstand. Or when I say misunderstand, what I mean is that I mean one thing, but you might mean something else. And that's where things tend to go wonky, really. The first thing is to define, when we talk about Muslim mental health, is what do we mean by Muslim? I'm not here to give you a definition of what a Muslim is, but it's important to understand that there is no Muslim community in the UK. There are Muslim communities in the UK, drawn from all over the world, some of whom are indigenous, some of whom come from the Middle East, some of them come from the subcontinent, and from all other places around the world. And each of them are a separate community. And each of them have separate or different cultural norms. Each of them have, therefore, different terminologies, different languages or words that they use to express the way that they are feeling. After all, what is language? We talk about, I might ask a patient, are you depressed? And what does that patient understand when I use the word depression? Or better still, if I say, are you anxious? I've sat in front of a lot of patients. I was, actually until yesterday, working in a very high density, a population, a community rather, that had a very high density of Muslim patients. Those of you who know Birmingham, it was Little Pakistan, that's Alam Rock, Ward End, Washford Heath, Small Heath, that sort of area. And I think probably 60 to maybe 70% of every clinic that I ran had Muslim patients in it. So if I ask a question to an Auntie G and I say, are you anxious? Are you feeling anxious? And she says, what do you mean by anxious? Now I've got to try and figure out how to get across all the symptoms of anxiety into one pithy word. Now you're already saying it. It's gabrat. That's the word I use, is gabrat. But gabrat doesn't quite mean the same thing as the DSM classification of anxiety. So one has to be a bit careful about that. We have to understand that different people have different terms, different expressions that they use. And they have different cultural norms, they have different ways of dealing with things. And so you're not dealing with one community. However, the reason that we're here talking about it is that there are certain factors that unite these very disparate communities. And we'll come to what they are. I think Slade's going to need some place to sit. We're going to look at what some of those factors are to help us navigate this. The second is the word mental. And this is fascinating. I mean, psychiatry is great. The reason I got into psychiatry is because I didn't know what I was doing, and neither did psychiatrists. And so that's always a good place to be. I was a good fit. I felt nice and comfortable there. What do we mean by mental? What's the mind? How is the mind different from the brain? How is the mind different from the soul? How is that different from the body? What are we dealing with? Patients would ask me this. What are you dealing with? And for some of them, different strokes for different folks. For some of them I would say, they said, well, aren't you a neurologist? And I said, no, I'm not a neurologist. But what's the difference? Oh, God. What's the difference between a neurologist and a psychiatrist? And I said, well, neurologists deal with defects that you can see on an MRI scan, generally. Psychiatrists deal with defects that you can't. For that patient, it was just easier to say, I'm a microneurologist. I just deal with pathology that's so small that you can't pick it up on a scan. Fine. But they say, no, you deal with the mind. You don't deal with the brain, you deal with the mind. Students tell me this, we deal with the mind. I said, where's it? Where is it? Where is this mind that we treat? What do we mean by the mind? When you say mind, you mean not the body. Generally, that's what you mean by the mind. It's something abstract. It's something almost that sits on top of the brain somewhere, or that's lurking somewhere inside the brain, inside this mass of neurons. Recently, a study has been done, and they've done the most accurate ever surveys of the brain, the most accurate scans of the brain that have ever been done, and they're hoping to find out where personality lies, where identity lies, and these types of things. So what is the mind? We have a concept of this thing called the mind in Western society. How do you translate mind into Arabic? I can translate brain into Arabic, it's dimagh. I can translate soul into Arabic, there's a number of terms for it. Ruh is the most common of them. You're not going to stand for the whole thing, are you? Oh, you're going to be that's going to be terrible. How do you translate mind into Arabic? Wana? Mind, aql, that's reason. There isn't a direct translation, and the reason there isn't a direct translation is because the term mind is fundamentally Cartesian in nature. It comes from what's called a Cartesian duality. Descartes was, you all know I think therefore I am, but there was a lot more to Descartes than that. Cartesian geometry, for example. But Descartes had this idea about the dualism of mind and body. That you have the body, and the body is effectively a machine, this brilliant, amazing machine that you can fix sometimes when it goes wrong. And that came up, you get from there this idea that's very prominent in Western, the whole way medicine is approached in the West. Not just psychiatry, but the whole of medicine is approached, which is the doctor as mechanic. That's what doctors do. You take your car to a mechanic, there's a problem with the cam belt, the mechanic changes the cam belt. You need new spark plugs, the doctor fits new spark plugs. You go to a doctor's surgery and there's a problem with your heart valve, so they get replaced. There's a problem with this, so you get a tune-up. There's a problem with that, so they change X, Y, and Z. And that's very much the philosophy of medicine. The body is a machine, and machines can be fixed, most of the time. That becomes quite difficult in psychiatry, because what is it that you are fixing? You're not fixing the brain, you're fixing the mind. But you can't see the mind. You don't know what its parameters are. You don't know how to get your hands on it. So what are we actually doing? What do we mean? Mental health, mental well-being. And I'm going to leave that out there because I don't know the answer. All right? And the other thing is illness. We talk about illness. What's a mental illness? Well, schizophrenia is a mental illness. Depression is a mental illness. What about being a bit stubborn? Is being a bit stubborn a mental illness? Being a stickler for rules and things being done in a particular order? Well, it's there in the manual. It's obsessive compulsive personality disorder, or it's an anancastic personality. It's there. It's there. What makes it a disorder? What makes it an illness? How do you define illness? When are you sad and when are you depressed? When are you happy and when are you manic? When do you hear a voice speaking to you but are not psychotic? Were God's prophets psychotic? Did they have temporal lobe epilepsy? How do you make a distinction between normal and abnormal? A normal sadness and an abnormal depression. That's a very touchy area. And movements like in the 60s, the anti-psychiatry movement, or in more recent times, the critical psychiatry movement, are very big on this. Now, hold on a second. Why are you saying that this is abnormal and needs treatment? At what point does something require treatment? And at what point is it simply part of the human experience? There's a disorder called SAD, seasonal affective disorder. In winter you feel low in mood, in summer you feel better. And it has to do with the amount of light in the atmosphere. It tends to be in northern parts of the world, like where we live, up north. Someone got a shock once when I said so. I said, do you know that we're on the same latitude as Siberia? What? I said, yeah. We're on the same latitude as Moscow. Glasgow is in the same latitude as Moscow. We live closer to the North Pole than we live to the equator. We are the frozen north. Congratulations. We are the frozen north. How do you define whether a normal feeling of being a bit down in winter and a bit happier when the sun's out is normal or abnormal? That's a very tricky distinction. One of the problems that we have in psychiatry when we come to classifying things is that we don't have etiological classifications. What that means is we don't classify things on the basis of cause. I've been studying psychiatry probably for about 10 years. If you ask me today, what is the cause of depression? I ain't got a clue. I've got some theories, but I don't know. If you ask me what the cause of malaria is, even though I haven't studied malaria for years and years and years and years, I say, well, it's a parasite called I can't remember what it's called now, Falciparum malariae or something like that. There's this thing, there's this bug, it gets into you and it messes up your red blood cells. And that's what malaria is. What's depression, meant to be my specialist subject on Mastermind? What causes it? I don't know. So how do I know it's a depression? I know because there's a cluster of symptoms that occurs. And what we do, what the manuals do, is they take all human experience and they take a grid and they go like that. So you imagine you've got a nice sort of pastry, right? And you take your grid and you push it over and you bang it down. You see that cupcake there? That's called depression. That cupcake over there? That's called schizophrenia. And there are reasons for doing it. I'm not saying it's entirely arbitrary. It clearly isn't. But there is an element of arbitrariness to the diagnosis of a mental illness that is not present in certain other aspects of medicine. And that's again important to understand, because when do I tell a patient what you're going through is normal? You don't need any medication for this. You just need a bit of TLC. And when do I say to them, no, this isn't normal? You actually do require treatment. So what I've done here is taken the concept of Muslim mental illness and hopefully upset the apple cart completely. So now we have absolutely no idea what we're talking about. But try to keep some of these ambiguities in your mind as we go through the rest of this. He says, right, so what's psychiatry then? It's really interesting. This psychiatry, psyche, iatros, and it means healing the soul. Psyche, again, in Greek, is a word that means both mind and soul. It's an interchangeable word. And psychology is the same thing. It's the study of the soul, stroke, mind. That which you are, that which makes you you. And that's very interesting, because if you tell a psychiatrist that you are healing the soul, they get a bit twitchy. So do priests, actually. When you say, I'm a psychiatrist, what do? I heal the soul. Don't. That's not your job. Right. It's interesting, isn't it? These are the words that we use. All right? Can we jump on? Sure. Right. So, We're going to be talking about the Muslim experience of mental illness. And the first question I want to ask you is, does it make any sense to talk about the Muslim experience of mental illness? We don't talk about the Muslim experience of cardiac illness, or the Muslim experience of respiratory illness. But we talk about the Muslim experience of mental illness. Why? Are Muslims some sort of aliens? Do we work in different ways? Why do we have this? Okay? A purely biological approach to psychiatry. Psychiatry goes through swings and roundabouts. You have periods where everyone is very big on biology. That biology is the answer. You have periods. Who's the most famous psychiatrist? Freud. Right? Freud did generally, I don't want to oversimplify him, but he generally did not take a biological approach to psychiatry. Okay? He took a psychological approach to psychiatry, a process approach perhaps, rather than about the nuts and bolts of how the brain works. There was a strong swing towards once psychiatrists discovered which wasn't carbamazepine, was it? Tegretol, I think. This drug that treated schizophrenia. There was a massive swing. We can do everything biologically. When I was training, when I was an undergraduate medical student, everything was about biology. It's all about the drugs. The drugs will sort it out. Now the pendulum swung back again. In the last 10 to 15 years, there have been no real breakthroughs where medication and psychiatry are concerned. We're all using the stuff that we were using 10, 15 years ago, and there's nothing really new on the horizon. There's really nothing that's out there. There are things that come up every now and then that deal with medication, but there's nothing really out there. So we're kind of swinging back. I was at a talk given by the previous dean of the Royal College of Psychiatry, and he gave a talk on the place of religion in the treatment of mental illness. He's a Christian. The first thing he said was that 30 years ago, if I had stood on this platform and I had mentioned the R word, I would have been kicked out of the Royal College. I would have been kicked out of the Royal College. Today, the special interest group on spirituality and psychiatry in the Royal College is the fastest growing special interest group in the Royal College of Psychiatry. There's a huge interest in spiritual aspects of psychiatry. Some of the most recommended forms of psychotherapy now are called the third wave psychotherapy. And they include things that are effectively Buddhist meditation techniques, like mindfulness, like compassion-focused therapy, and so forth, in the treatment of mental illnesses. So a purely biological approach to psychiatry will say, no, there is no variation on the basis of culture, and certainly not on the basis of religion. Because we all have brains, they all have neurons, they're joined by synapses, you have the same neurotransmitters inside them. If you stick some serotonin in there, this is what's going to happen. It should happen for everyone. It doesn't happen for everyone. Why doesn't it happen for everyone? There must be more to it than biology. So we all know that a purely biological approach to psychiatry is problematic. However, even some approaches to psychotherapy don't, in practice, take into consideration the cultural or faith-based variations. I'm not really here to talk about the cultural aspects. I want to focus on the religious or the spiritual aspects of what I'm talking about here. Okay, and that becomes quite important when we get to psychology. One of the attendees, mentioned, I got very interested later in my career on the Islamization of psychology, and I said, hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about it, and I still hope I will. But this becomes quite important when you get to looking at psychotherapy. Why is there an issue about the Islamization of psychotherapy? Well, we'll move on for the time being. Now, you all know this, there's nothing exciting on this slide. We've got all these Muslims. They all have mental, not all of them. There's a lot of mental illness among them, and there are certain things that are different. The communities differ. They differ on the basis of culture. They differ on the basis of their socioeconomic status, on the basis of how integrated or not integrated are they into the indigenous population or the culture of the UK. We have these micro-cultures, right? We have these micro-cultures when we deal with aspects of law, Islamic law. Sometimes we talk about urf and aada. What is the urf? What is the custom of a people? Al-urf muhakkama. The custom of a people is legally binding with certain conditions. What is the customary practice of Muslims in this country? Well, there isn't one. There are many. Within families there are. different micro-cultures. There are these variations, and these variations play a role in the expression of personality, and therefore the expression of disorders of personality. Okay? And of course language is really key. I'll show you a bit of stuff on it a bit later. But there are unifying things. Of course, all Muslims are united on beliefs. Muslims have a remarkably, among all the variation that we have and all the different groupings that we have, there is a remarkable unity of belief. Pretty much every Muslim on the planet believes in the same 6 articles of faith. They may have certain differences about what they believe about each one, but pretty much those 6 things, belief in God, belief in the prophets, belief in the scriptures, belief in the angels, the day of judgment, and belief in destiny, pretty much cut and dried. Every Muslim believes in it. But then there is this other thing here, which is the centrality of faith to a Muslim, to the Muslims. That's a unifying factor, because generally, by and large, especially when they become unwell, Muslims will tend to view what they are experiencing not through a inverted commas psychological, they are not psychologically minded in the conventional sense of the word, but they are spiritually minded. They will very much view what they are going through their faith, in terms of their faith. Religious practice, of course, is pretty much the same. And also, I've put that in red there, these elements of pathological spirituality. I'm going to come back to that, because there is sometimes an assumption that spirituality is always good. Not always. Nothing is that simple. There are elements of pathological spirituality or expressions of spirituality that are detrimental to that person's mental health, that are present pretty much across all the different cultures that we experience, and, interestingly, among all the different socioeconomic groups. Okay. Right. So, generally, psychiatrists, when we talk about an integrated approach, we are referring to this famous phrase, the biopsychosocial method, or the biopsychosocial approach, that one understands the genesis and the natural history of the distress that this specific individual is presenting at this moment on the basis of 3 bases. The biology, psychology, and their social circumstances, if you like. Okay? And therefore, you formulate a patient on the basis of this. And therefore, you formulate treatment on the basis of their biology, of helping them with any cognitive distortions or what have you, their psychology, and helping them with any social problems that they have, helping their social circumstances. This is the unified approach, which is, by and large, a very good approach. Now, how does it present? I'm going to flash through this. Presentations. So, what are the common factors that I've experienced over the last 3 years that I've been dealing with this population? I've seen 1,000 patients perhaps, face to face, known many more on the basis of my team and so forth. What are the common factors that we can get together here? Right. Generally speaking, Muslim mental illness presents later than the general population. Okay? And varies in accordance with the condition, and specifically in terms of the specific religious beliefs and specific cultural beliefs about that condition. Depressions will come before, generally speaking, will come earlier than schizophrenias will come. Because schizophrenias, generally speaking, or psychoses, are viewed to be a spiritual problem, and therefore you will go through the imams, the pirs, and whoever else needs to go through the sheikhs, the iraqis, and so forth. When all that fails, then you go to the GP. Depression or anxiety, it was seen much more as, oh, this is a mental problem. This is a problem with how they're thinking. Let's go to the GP. Okay? By and large. The next thing is that family support, on balance, is better than most communities in the UK. You've got extended family networks. You've got a lot of support. Those family links are still quite strong, and therefore patients, you find that extended families provide good care. However, there are quite poor levels of psychoeducation. I sometimes say that the levels of psychoeducation among current day Muslim community are about the same as in the indigenous population about 30 or 40 years ago. Same sort of stereotypes, same sort of ideas, same sort of stigma is attached to it, which the indigenous population by and large has moved on from, the Muslim community is still in that place for reasons that are way beyond the scope of this particular talk. The next common thing is that self-harm and suicide, generally speaking, suicide levels are lower among the Muslim populations, of course, because of the very strong, the centrality of the faith and the spiritual understanding of what they're going through. Most, not all of course, but most Muslim patients will perceive what they're going through as a test from God in some way or other. Some of them may be very comforted by that, some of them may be very distressed by it, but generally speaking, the levels of suicidal intent and planning are lower in the Muslim community. However, this is dependent on religious faith, and this isn't a cultural thing, this is very much about the religious faith that those people have. Self-harm, on the other hand, is increasing. And self-harm levels are probably coming up to, I don't have stats with me now, but are probably coming up to levels that are seen in other communities. There's a lot of self-harm in the Muslim community, especially among younger females. Okay? And then the other common factor is the usefulness of therapy, the usefulness of psychotherapy specifically. Language is a huge problem, especially in ghettoized Muslim populations. Language is a huge problem. And many, many people, the only sort of treatment that they get effectively is drugs, especially among the older generation, because there just isn't the support, there just isn't the infrastructure to give them psychotherapy in their own language. But that's not the only problem. The other problem, of course, is that the cultural beliefs and the religious beliefs sometimes contradict the work that's being done in psychotherapy. And what I mean by that is nothing pernicious. What I mean by that is simply this. If you have a psychotherapist telling you, for example, that you see this problem, this depression that you have at the moment, this is because even though I'm a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, so I can afford to generalize horribly about psychologists, and I say, this is because of a problem that you had with your mother. Okay? And the patient might say, okay, fair enough, and we'll talk about it, yeah, okay, fair enough. What a Muslim patient will tend to do at that point, or at that point will tend to say is, yeah, that's important, but that's not what my religion tells me. And so what you have immediately is a bit of a gap that forms between the therapist and the patient. You have this, but they don't really understand. They don't really understand, and how could they? They're not Muslim. They don't know about the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him. They don't know about the Quran. They don't know about the soul, really. They know about the mind, but they don't know about the soul. So how could they possibly understand what I'm going through, really? And what you have is a gap. And when you have a gap, as a therapist, it's very, very difficult to make progress. And what you find is that patients come, and then after 3 or 4 sessions, they'll come back to me and they'll say, it's not good. They're very nice, they're really nice, lovely to talk to them, but it's not helping. It's not helping. They don't understand me. And what I get, because I've got a big beard and I wear a hat, is they don't understand me like you understand me, doctor. Or even, they don't understand me like you understand me, sheikh. And I was really popular. I was popular not because I was a good doctor, hopefully I was an okay doctor, but I was popular because I was seen as a sheikh. And people would sit in outpatients clinics and talk about all sorts of different things, medication and therapy and this and that. And then at the end they would say, what can I read? What wazifa can I read? And I tell them, okay, so read Surah Yasin 11 times, do this, do that, do the other. And they said, yeah. And when they came back in 2 months' time, how you feel? Oh, much better. What helped? That thing you told me about the Yasin thing really worked. Everything else was forgotten about. But the Yasin thing really worked. That's important. Because the placebo effect is not a void. The placebo effect is incredibly powerful. You take 100 patients that are depressed. Okay? You give half of them an antidepressant and counselling. Or you give a third of them antidepressants and counselling. A third of them just antidepressants, and a third of them placebos. What do you get? You get, for those who've got nothing at all, yeah, that's right, 10% tend to get better. For those who get the medication alone, 40% tend to get better. Those who get medication and, or rather, I messed this up now. Yeah, those who, let me make this short. The placebo effect accounts for 30% of the recovery of patients. That's enormous. That's 1/3 of people get better because they believe they're going to get better. That's very, very powerful. And what is the placebo effect? Basically, it's the therapeutic relationship. Basically. So how would you go about establishing a therapeutic relationship with a Muslim client? You have to take their religion into account. Okay, let's scoot on. Right, I'm not going to go through this. There's a few slides on the different types of presentations. Let's just move on, shall we? Yeah, let's go on, let's go on. Right, Islamic perspectives. Islamic perspectives on Muslim mental illness. So what is the classical tradition? What does the Muslim tradition say about this? This is a 1,000-year-old tradition. The treatment of mental distress, or spiritual distress, in the Muslim community has a 1,000-year-old set of traditions, which most people have absolutely no idea about, unfortunately. And that's a great pity. But anyway. Historical perspective, exciting here, the origins of writing on psychological, there's two sort of origins. There's the Mediterranean type writings, and then there's these sort of Indo-Persian type writings on this stuff. What you had in around the 8th century in the Muslim world, centered around Baghdad as the House of Wisdom, you have the bringing together of all this information, massive translations. There was a scholar called, I forget his name, I think his name was Al-Farabi. He escaped the sack of Baghdad, the Mongol sack of Baghdad in about 10th century, and it was Al-Razi. He escaped with 100,000 manuscripts. He managed to salvage 100,000 manuscripts. It's estimated that was about 4% of the manuscripts that were present in the House of Wisdom. Huge amounts of writing on this. That filters, of course, into the European world through whether it's the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and so forth. You get this filtering into the European subcontinent, and then you get direct influence on the modern practice, Aquinas, Descartes, and so forth. One thing that's quite important here, we talk about psychotherapy, we talk about this, we talk about that. It's really important to understand that all of these things are based on a philosophy. Okay? Any science has a philosophical basis. When you forget the philosophical basis of the science, you run into problems because you release the ship from its moorings and it begins to drift. Okay? So the practice of science is founded on the philosophy of the scientific endeavor, which is that you begin with observation, you repeat the observations, you formulate a theory, then you attempt to falsify the theory. If you cannot falsify the theory, you have a law that has been proven. But science begins with observation, which is why science has nothing to say about the existence or not of God, because science begins with observation. Does not begin, as philosophy does, with a priori statements. Psychiatry, the practice of medicine, the practice of psychology also has an underlying philosophy that you and I do not study. Do not study it. Because we do not study it, we very rarely question the underlying assumptions that drive that science. That's extremely problematic. It works okay most of the time. However, when the push comes to shove, we have a problem. Let's move on. Thank you. I won't go on to this slide, so we can just move straight on. Now, a question we often get asked, and it comes up, is this a spiritual problem or is it a medical problem? All right? This fundamentally comes back, I suppose, one of the ways of looking at it is nature versus nurture. And the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, had a very interesting thing to say about this, which is كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ يُولَدُ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ. He says every child that is born upon a fitra. It's an Arabic word that has a lot of different meanings. And then it is their parents that make them Jewish or make them Christian or make them whatever it happens to be. What the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, here is saying is that there is an element of the human personality that is innate. It's just what you're born with. And then there is an environmental influence. There is both nature and nurture. Okay? Now, what does the fitra mean? It has a number of different understandings classically. I don't have the time to go through them now. The one I want to focus on, however, is that it is what makes you you. It is your personality. The way we would put that, I suppose, in this day and age, is it is your genetic loading. It's what's transmitted in the genes, okay? Or the way in which those genes are expressed. There is an element of this that is simply about the way that you are wired. But then there is an element that is about your environmental factor. So there is a biological element, there is a psychological element, and there is a social element to the way in which you and I are. If one thing changed in our lives, we would be very different people, okay, especially in the early years, which is why the raising of children is a very, very important topic ethically. In Islamic ethics, the raising of children is very, very important. Why? Because the influence of the early years is very important. Al-ilmu fi as-sighar kan-naqshi ala al-hajar. That which is learned as a child is as though written on stone. That is to say, it doesn't simply have an influence on your practice, but an influence on your personality. Anyway, so, sorry, yes, that weird diagram. I'm trying to find one. Spiritual and biological. Classical Islamic medicine, traditional Islamic medicine, which is basically Greek medicine Islamized, okay, with elements of Ayurveda in there as well, if you look deep enough. What do you find? Well, you find that mental distress is viewed along a spectrum. And that spectrum runs from what you might call biological through to the spiritual. At one end of the spectrum you have the hakim, the doctor. And you have the person's temperament, their mizaj. So are you bilious temperament, a melancholic temperament, or your temperament which has physical effects, but also has effects on your personality. The hakim treats that, and the hakim treats it with diet, with various forms of medication, and so forth. On the other end of that spectrum, you have the spiritual aspects of what's happening to this person, and that tends to be treated by the sheikh or the murshid or what have you. All right? And that's very much about the soul. And it's treated with worship, with reflection, with contemplating the self, and so forth. So we have both of these things, and what's really crucial, and I'm going to come across in that slide, is this bit here. This bit here, that's you. That's you, that triangle there is you. Okay? There is no meaningful division between body and soul in the Islamic discourse. The only time in the whole of the life of your soul that you are without a body is before you were born. Is before you came into existence. In the womb, in this world, in the barzakh, on the day of judgment, and the final abode, you are both body and soul. It's a very important part of traditional or orthodox Islamic doctrine. The body is not simply a vehicle for the soul. The soul can't really exist in any meaningful form without the body. The soul cannot experience God without the body. And there is a very, very close integration of these two concepts, so much so that they're not really separate. And that's really important to understand as well. Okay. Right. Let's move on. Let's move on. Yeah. Okay. I want to give an example of how one of the ways in which there are a number of these. There are two examples I've given. This is the topic of automatic thoughts. A negative automatic thought is beloved of psychotherapists, CBT psychotherapists everywhere. A negative automatic thought is a thought that pops into your head. You don't know where it came from. It's there. It's just there. Okay? I'm useless. I'm stupid. Nobody loves me. I'm going to fail. I have to wash my hands again. These are negative automatic thoughts. You don't think about them, they're just there. And they're often very, very distressing. Where do they come from? From the Islamic perspective, this is the waswasa. This is, or the nafs. The whispering, tahdith al-nafs it's called. The whispering or the conversation of the soul. It is, and there are two forms of these thoughts. There are positive automatic thoughts and negative automatic thoughts. The nafs of shaitan and the nafs of rahman. The whisper of the all-merciful and the whisper of the devil. Now, which devil? This is really important. The Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, said that every person, when they are born, effectively, a devil is inserted into them, is injected into them. You know that one, right? Yes. You are carrying a dark passenger. The interesting thing about this is it happens when you're born. It happens before you even know that there is a difference between you and your mother. It happens before you've even individuated. It's the very first thing you experience. In fact, it's before you experience anything. It's before you take your first breath, indeed, according to the hadith, the words of the hadith. It's before you even take your first breath. What that means is, as you grow, that dark element of your personality is not you. It's really, to see it as something separate from yourself is probably incorrect. It's been a part of you, it's always been a part of you. It's there. And when it speaks to you, it doesn't speak in the second person. It doesn't say you're stupid. It doesn't say nobody loves you. It says I'm stupid and nobody loves me. And differentiating between the voice of the devil within, the dark part of your personality, and the whisper of the All-Merciful is something that is critical in dealing with Muslim mental health. Can we just go back a slide? One more, sorry. And one more. Just testing. This particular saying here, this one here. Goodness is what brings peace to the heart. And sinfulness is what causes a restlessness. Restlessness. A companion came to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, and said, he didn't say anything actually, but the Prophet said to him, have you come to ask me about righteousness? And the companion said, yes, I have. And the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, has described righteousness in a number of different ways, and it's described in the Quran as believing in God and giving charity and praying and being steadfast and being truthful and honest and all of these things. But the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, says something very interesting. He said goodness, he defines goodness by its effect on you, by its emotional impact on the heart. He says goodness is what brings peace to your heart. And what goodness are we talking about here? Actions, yes. But also thoughts. What is a good thought? What is a positive thought? A positive automatic thought? How do you differentiate between the whisper of the devil and the whisper of the All-Merciful? Well, you've got an alarm system built in. If that automatic thought is bringing you a sense of peace, a sense of tranquility, then you know that it's coming from God. If it's not, if it's bringing you distress, then it's coming from the devil. The theology of how to deal with the devil, whether the internal one or the external one, in Islam, is extensive. My time is up. That was one element. I'll just show you the slide on it. Just there you go. These negative automatic thoughts come out generally in four ways. They can be depressive, provoking depression, or producing depression, or precipitating depression. They can produce anxiety. They can produce paranoia. They can produce obsession. Which are kind of the four things that we tend to deal with in mental illness. And they all come back to one source. And the answer to them is very simple, and I've done this with patients in 5 minutes in an outpatient clinic. If a thought brings any of those, it's coming from the devil. And what do you know about the devil? You know that the devil lies. So all you do is you take that thought and you add the word not to it. I'm a failure. I'm not a failure. No one loves me. No one doesn't love me. Cross out the two negatives. Someone loves me. Who? God loves me. It's not going to work. It is going to work. That's a very, very simple but powerful technique that people can actually use. I'm going to stop it there. I didn't get to talk about ways forward, which is a pity. I thought that might happen. But all I will say, I think, on the subject, I'll give you one more minute. All I will say on the subject is this. There are a number of initiatives regarding counselling for Muslim people that are springing up. There are two of them that I particularly have come across that I'm impressed with. The first one is based here. Am I allowed to mention the name? I don't know. Am I allowed to mention the name? I don't know. All right? And that's Islamic Social Services kind of society thing, led by Dr. Asim Yusuf. Okay? The second one is actually based in Birmingham, and it's called the Latif Project. And I work quite closely with the Latif Project, run by Dr. Abdullah Maynard. There's a difference that these two particular initiatives have that others tend not to, and that is, well, two differences. The first of them is that both of the heads, of both of the people heading them, are actually trained in the traditional approach. Both of them are trained in that, as well as in Western approaches to psychotherapy. And the second is both of them are mainstreamed. Both of them are mainstreamed. They don't exist in ghettos. They don't exist only in a particular, as privately run things or run out of the masjid and stuff. They are linked to the NHS. They are linked to GP practices. They are linked to structures in this country, and that's incredibly important if you want to actually make a difference. If you want to Islamize psychology, psychotherapy, firstly, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's been done. It's been done. However, it isn't in the systematic form that we are used to, and that's the problem. That's a great barrier to access. You can't go and do a course on it. You can do some courses, low-level courses, but you can't do a course on it, because it exists largely in the hearts of spiritual masters, in the hearts of teachers. And this is actually exactly the same as the subject of the study of Islamic law. Before it was systematized in the schools of law, existed as an ability, an innate ability in the hearts of masters. And what happened as in the process of the systematization of Islamic thought is it was systematized. It's systematized so that we can understand it. It's a bit like learning to cook. Your mum and your grandma and so forth, they know how to cook, but they know how to cook innately. They know that you need this much masala. But when you put it in a recipe book, you can't say you need this much masala. You say you need a quarter of a teaspoon. And what needs to happen, the great challenge facing Muslim mental health in this country, is to systematize an already existent, potent system, and to do what has always been done across centuries, which is to take the best of what has come in the scripture and the best of what is out there, to take the knowledge that exists in China, to take the knowledge that exists in Europe and so forth, but to bring it into a framework that chimes with the fundamental metaphysic of Muslim understanding. If you do that, we can do that, I think that the mental health of Muslims in this country will be a lot better. And sorry for going over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asim. That was fantastic. I'm sorry we don't have enough time. I've got so many questions to ask Dr. Asim on pathological spirituality, on demonic possession. Well, we can ask you these questions.
I got through the whole talk without mentioning jinn possession.
Yeah. I'm going to prod you more at dinner today.
Yeah.
I have to say that I have a PhD in Hadith, but your reading of Inna Shaytana Yajri Min Al-Insani Majra Dam, that shaitan is a dark passenger, I've never come across that before, so thank you very much for that original contribution. Can we have some questions from the floor, please?
First, the point of information I didn't quite catch. You mentioned a project in Birmingham, yes, and you also mentioned Islamic social something. Could you tell me again what those two were?
I think there's probably people here that know it better than me. I know
what they're called.
Latif, the Latif project, L-A-T-I-F, L-A-T-I-F.
Pardon me?
L-A-T-I-F.
Yeah.
Project.
Yeah.
That runs out of Birmingham, and it's Issa Wales. I mean,
Yes, social science.
oh, is it changed now?
Yeah, it's changed.
Okay.
Can we just tell the correct pronunciation is Ihsan Social Support Association?
All right, because I knew it as. All right, that's great. That's so much better actually. I knew it as Issa, so that's brilliant. Thank you.
So the question I wanted to ask, I can just share something with people here before I ask my question. There happens to be a health fair at Cardiff City Hall tomorrow, specifically for those of minority ethnic religions and communities. And so there will appear to be, perhaps they'll have mental health included amongst it. I believe it's from 9:30 till 3 o'clock at Cardiff City Hall. And also like to share a Temple of Peace on the Friday about empowering girls and women, and presumably it will sort of cover perhaps health issues as well. The Temple of Peace, I believe it's on on Friday from 6 to 8, and I know that there are representatives of Muslim communities there, so I wanted to ask. Now what I wanted to ask you was, you talked about the importance of the placebo effect. You said 30%, I believe. So what was so if the people just had, as it were, the drugs, what was the percentage effect? Or if they had drugs plus therapy, what's the effect? What was the effect?
I got the figures mixed up in my head. If a person had the active drug as well as the therapeutic relationship and so forth, it's about a 70%, tends to be a 70% response rate. If a person has a placebo as well as the therapeutic support and that type of stuff, there tends to be a 40% response rate. If a person has neither of them, it tends to be about 10% rate of improvement. That's over a period, I think, of about 6 months. That's over a period of about 6 months. So
when you say none of them, you mean what?
They have no input at all. There's no medication, there's no therapeutic intervention. They are effectively let natural, let the illness to follow its natural course.
So it's critical, presumably, that there is somebody who can input the importance of the social, cultural, religious, everything background, as well as the psychiatric assessment of the person concerned. That seems to be critical. And how can you ensure that this is the case in the future in communities?
Effectively, yes. I mean, the point is, if the placebo effect is effectively the bond of trust that exists between therapist and patient, or psychiatrist and patient for that matter, and the fact that the person feels listened to, they're given good advice, sound advice, and so forth, and that has such a great impact. The key thing there is the relationship of trust, and it's not simply about I believe that this person has beneficence towards me as opposed to maleficence. It's about, I believe that this person understands exactly what's happening to me. And that's really the key to a therapeutic relationship. This person knows what I'm going through and understands where I'm coming from. And it's at that point, really, that if you want to sort of break things down into compartments, where a Muslim mental health or a Hindu mental health or a Sikh mental health, what have you, comes in, is in that bit there. Does the service user or the patient feel that this person really gets what's going on?
Is that happening now?
Can we please not have any follow-up questions?
No,
time is very limited.
Is it happening?
No. I would say.
Ros?
Thank you for a really interesting talk. You mentioned about the growing special interest group in spirituality at the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
Yeah.
And my question is, although there is an increasing engagement with spirituality, do you think there's still some reluctance to talk more concretely about religion? I'm aware that there's a growing interest in spirituality in fields like social work and healthcare, but some have said that this is often very sort of secular forms of spirituality, and some commentators have suggested that religious forms of spirituality might still be being marginalised.
Yes, I think it's a short answer to that. I think there is much more acceptance of generic spirituality than there is of religion specifically. The surveys, there are a number of surveys to ascertain how important is spirituality in somebody's life, and they use very bland and very generic terms, which I assume they have to because they're dealing with such a wide range of people. There has been one developed in Birmingham recently, which actually allows a proper ascertaining of what role religion specifically plays in that person's life. So they literally have a questionnaire that has, and do you think that X, is a source of comfort for you? And that X can be God, it can be Jesus, it can be whatever you like, Yoda if you want it to be. But yes, there is still more reluctance, certainly about the use of religious terminology in therapy, certainly, because of a number of cases recently. There was this, I think it was an evangelical Christian doctor who said that he'd pray for a patient. It was a bit more than that, but he was actually struck off the register. I was talking to a colleague of mine who said, yeah, I use the spiritual type stuff, but I'm really reluctant about using religion because I don't want to get into trouble, basically. Yeah. In the college, the special interest group, I'm pretty sure, is called Spirituality and Religion. But I think that generic forms of spirituality tend, or secular, if you like, forms of spirituality, i.e. Spiritual concepts denuded of any theological weight, tends to be utilised. Mindfulness is a good example of that. It is basically Buddhist meditation. However, all of the theological connotations have been taken away from it, so that it can be a universal tool, effectively. Yeah. So I'm not sure whether that answers the question.
One more question. We have to wrap up. I'm sorry. Well, thank you very much. Can we give a round of applause for the speaker?